Once the world's second-largest economy, Japan was unstoppable. Its technology ruled the future, from Walkmans to bullet trains, from Sony to Toyota. In the 1980s, Japan wasn't just rising, it was rewriting what success looked like. Land in Tokyo was worth more than all the real estate in California. The Nikkei index soared past 38,000. Economists called it the miracle of modern capitalism. But miracles, it turned out, could fade. When the bubble burst in 1991, Japan's miracle became a mystery, a nation that never truly recovered. According to the IMF, Japan's GDP growth averaged below 1% for nearly 3 decades, even as the world surged ahead, and for millions of Japanese workers, it wasn't just numbers that collapsed, it was hope, ambition, and the dream of unstoppable progress. How did the brightest economy of the 20th century become trapped in its own shadow? Japan didn't just experience a recession. It entered a new kind of economic era, one where growth froze, innovation slowed, and the population began to shrink. For decades, Japan's economy was the envy of the world, a blueprint for success. But somewhere between the triumphs of the 1980s and the realities of the 2000s, that blueprint cracked. In 1990, Japan's stock market crashed. Property values evaporated. Banks held toxic debts they could never recover. The government tried to fight back with stimulus and zero interest rates, but the damage was already done. The so-called lost decade stretched into 2, and now 3. According to the OECD, Japan's real GDP growth has averaged just 0.7% since 1992, compared to over 2.4% in the US during the same period. An entire generation grew up without knowing what real economic growth feels like. For many Japanese families, the idea of a better tomorrow became a fading memory, replaced by quiet endurance, and the weight of expectations that never arrived. Today, Japan faces a new enemy, not inflation or debt, but demographics. With one of the world's oldest populations and a fertility rate among the lowest on Earth, Japan's workforce is shrinking faster than it can be replaced. The World Bank projects that by 2050, Japan's population could fall below 100 million, threatening every pillar of its economy. What happens when a nation built on relentless growth learns to live with decline, not for a year but for a lifetime? Japan's story isn't just about the past. It's a mirror, reflecting the future challenges that many developed nations are now beginning to face. Aging populations, stagnant wages, and debt-fueled illusions of growth. How did Japan, the miracle that once conquered the world economy, become the warning no one wanted to hear? Out of the ashes of World War II, Japan rebuilt faster than anyone thought possible. Within just a generation, the nation went from devastation to domination, achieving one of the fastest GDP growth rates in modern history. Between 1955 and 1973, Japan's economy grew at an astonishing 9.3% annually, according to the World Bank. It was more than recovery, it was reinvention. Factories became symbols of pride. Precision became a national art form. From the transistor radio to the Walkman, from Toyota's assembly lines to Sony's innovation labs, Japan didn't just follow the West, it began to lead it. For a generation, it felt like Japan could do no wrong, as if the future itself was written in Japanese. By the late 80s, the success had turned into euphoria. Money flowed endlessly. The Nikkei stock index quadrupled in just 5 years. Property prices skyrocketed to surreal levels. By 1989, the land beneath Tokyo's Imperial Palace was said to be worth more than all the real estate in California combined. Banks lent recklessly. Corporations expanded wildly, and the government looked on with pride. The world watched, half in awe, half in fear, as Japan's wealth seemed to know no ceiling. For millions of young Japanese, it wasn't just prosperity. It was proof that their parents' sacrifices had paid off, that the past had finally been redeemed. But underneath the glittering surface, something fragile was forming, a bubble of belief that prices would never fall, that growth would never stop. Economists warned of danger, but few listened. After all, who questions a miracle when you're living inside it? Because when an empire begins to believe it's invincible, collapse is never far behind. In 1991, Japan's unstoppable rise came to a violent halt. The nation that once defied gravity suddenly crashed back to Earth. The Nikkei index, which had soared above 39,000 points, collapsed to 14,000 within just 2 years. Trillions of dollars in paper wealth gone. Property values evaporated almost overnight, wiping out decades of savings. Banks that had lent freely during the boom were now buried under mountains of unpaid debt. Homes once seen as golden assets were suddenly worth less than their mortgages. Confidence, the invisible fuel of any economy, vanished. For millions of Japanese families, it felt like waking from a dream, one that had turned into a nightmare they couldn't escape. The government tried to intervene, cutting interest rates, bailing out financial institutions, but the damage ran deep. The IMF later estimated that Japan's total asset losses exceeded $10 trillion, making it one of the largest financial collapses in modern history. Banks became zombies, kept alive by state support but too weak to lend. Businesses stopped expanding. Wages froze. The economy entered what would be called the lost decade. Behind every statistic was a story of small shop owners who lost everything, retirees watching their life savings disappear, and workers who never found stable jobs again. In some cases, despair turned fatal. Japan's suicide rate surged through the 1990s, reflecting not just economic pain, but a collective loss of purpose. By the end of the decade, Japan's GDP had barely moved. According to the World Bank, real growth averaged just 0.5%, an economy frozen in slow motion. The miracle had officially ended. Overnight, the miracle turned into a warning, one the rest of the world would only understand decades later. But why did Japan's lost decade never truly end? When Japan's economic bubble burst, the crash didn't just destroy wealth. It broke the system meant to rebuild it. Banks were drowning in bad loans. Thousands of companies couldn't pay their debts. But instead of letting them fail, the government stepped in, again and again. Public money flowed into private balance sheets. Insolvent banks were rescued, not restructured. The result was an economy full of institutions too big to collapse and too weak to recover. Economists would later call them zombie banks. According to the OECD, by 1995, over 30% of Japan's corporate debt was tied to firms that could not generate enough income to cover interest payments. Yet they were kept alive, sustained by cheap credit and government guarantees. For ordinary workers, this meant something subtle but devastating. Their jobs still existed, but their futures didn't. The dream of progress was replaced by quiet survival. These zombie companies dragged the entire economy down. New startups couldn't get loans. Risk-taking became a cultural taboo. Banks burned once, refused to lend again. Investment dried up. Deflation set in. Prices fell, confidence sank, and time itself seemed to stop. The IMF described Japan's recovery as frozen in motion. Growth stagnated, hovering around 1% or less for much of the 1990s and early 2000s. As one economist famously put it, Japan didn't crash. It froze. An entire generation came of age believing that ambition was dangerous, that failure wasn't a step, but a curse. What began as a financial crisis had become psychological, a paralysis rooted in fear. By saving the banks, Japan had unknowingly sacrificed its dynamism. Because when failure is never allowed to happen, neither is rebirth. So what happens when a nation stops believing in risk altogether? Japan's greatest enemy after the crash wasn't chaos, it was stillness. Prices stopped rising. At first, it seemed like stability. But underneath, a dangerous cycle had begun, one that would quietly drain the life out of the world's second-largest economy. When prices fall, people wait. Why buy today when tomorrow might be cheaper? As consumers delayed spending, companies stopped investing. Wages stagnated. The cycle reinforced itself. Low demand led to low growth, which led to even lower prices. By 1999, according to the Bank of Japan, consumer prices were falling year after year. The nation had entered sustained deflation for the first time in its modern history. The central bank slashed interest rates to nearly 0%, flooding markets with liquidity. But no matter how cheap money became, people and businesses refused to move. In a deflationary world, the future always feels smaller than the past, and hope itself begins to lose value. The OECD reported that between 1995 and 2010, Japan's nominal GDP barely grew, an almost unheard-of stagnation for a developed nation. For workers, that meant decades without raises. For businesses, it meant innovation on pause, Time, once Japan's ally, had turned against it. Every passing year made recovery harder, every delay more costly. Families learned to live not for progress, but for endurance, a quiet acceptance that tomorrow might not be better, only cheaper. Deflation wasn't just an economic condition. It was psychological, a slow erosion of confidence, of imagination, of the will to take risks. Japan hadn't just lost growth, it had lost momentum itself. And as the years passed, one question lingered. If time was Japan's greatest enemy, could anything ever restart it? Japan's next great crisis wasn't financial, it was biological. As the economy stagnated, the population began to age quietly and relentlessly. Today, nearly 30% of Japan's people are over the age of 65, according to the World Bank, the highest proportion in the developed world. The nation that once symbolized youth, energy, and innovation is now graying faster than any in history. Births are at record lows. Japan's fertility rate has fallen to just 1.2 children per woman, far below the replacement level of 2.1. Each year, more people die than are born, a demographic inversion with no modern precedent. In towns where children once filled playgrounds, silence has become the loudest sound. With fewer workers, the economy slows. Fewer taxpayers mean less revenue for pensions, healthcare, and infrastructure. The burden grows heavier on the young, who are fewer and increasingly disillusioned. The OECD warns that by 2050, Japan's working-age population could fall by nearly 40%, turning growth into an almost impossible dream. As factories automate and schools shut down, an entire way of life is vanishing. Some rural villages are now called Genkai Shiraku, communities on the brink of extinction. Over 1,200 towns across Japan have populations so old and small, they may disappear entirely within a decade. For many, the future no longer feels like something to chase, but something quietly slipping away. Japan's demographic time bomb didn't just shrink its economy, it froze its spirit. A society built for expansion is now learning how to contract. Every empty classroom, every abandoned street is a reminder. When a population ages faster than it innovates, decline becomes destiny. But even as the nation grows older, is there still a way for Japan to start anew? To the world, Japan still looks like the future. Robots serving sushi, bullet trains gliding with precision, vending machines that sell everything from books to umbrellas. But beneath the surface lies a paradox, a high-tech image masking a low-tech reality. Despite its reputation for innovation, Japan's productivity has stagnated for decades. According to the OECD, Japan's labor productivity is about 25% below the organization's average, ranking among the lowest in the developed world. The miracle nation that once reinvented manufacturing now struggles to reinvent itself. It's as if Japan built the tools to shape the 21st century, but forgot how to use them freely. The reasons lie not in technology, but in tradition. Corporate hierarchy remains rigid. Decision-making moves slowly through layers of bureaucracy. Lifetime employment, once the pride of Japan's workforce, now traps it in stagnation. Innovation depends on risk. Yet in Japan, failure is treated not as a lesson, but as shame. Startups struggle to survive. Venture capital remains scarce. According to the World Bank, Japan's startup investment rate is less than half that of the US or South Korea. In a culture that fears mistakes, even great ideas can die quietly in conference rooms. Japan makes the future, but can't sell it fast enough. From robotics to renewable energy, breakthroughs emerge every year, yet slow adaptation and conservative management keep them from scaling globally. As productivity stalls, wages stagnate, and the sense of forward motion fades. The IMF notes that Japan's total factor, productivity growth, has averaged barely 0.5% since the early 2000s, a sharp contrast to the dynamism of its 1980s peak. Behind the neon glow is a quiet truth. Progress isn't just about machines, but about mindset. So the question remains, can Japan's future brilliance ever escape its past? In 2012, Japan tried to rewrite its fate. After 2 lost decades, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe unveiled a bold new plan, one that promised to finally awaken the world's most stagnant economy. He called it Abenomics, a strategy built on 3 arrows: massive monetary easing, aggressive fiscal stimulus, and deep structural reform. The first arrow hit its target. The Bank of Japan unleashed unprecedented quantitative easing, flooding the market with liquidity. The yen weakened, exports rose, and the Nikkei stock index surged more than 150% between 2012 and 2018. Inflation, once negative, began to flicker back to life. For a moment, it felt like Japan was breathing again, a flicker of hope after 20 years of stillness. But beneath the optimism, the old problems remained untouched. The second and third arrows, government spending and reform, fell short. Productivity barely moved. Wages stayed flat. The OECD reported that by 2019, Japan's GDP per capita growth was still among the slowest in the G7. Structural barriers, aging demographics, rigid labor markets, and resistance to immigration blunted every policy success. When the pandemic hit, whatever fragile progress existed unraveled. COVID-19 stalled tourism, choked exports, and reignited deflation fears. Supply shocks and a shrinking workforce turned Abenomics' fragile gains into fading memories. By 2021, the IMF noted that Japan's debt had surpassed 260% of GDP, the highest among advanced economies, proof that stimulus alone couldn't rebuild confidence. Japan had thrown everything it could at its problems, except real change itself. Abenomics was supposed to be a cure. Instead, it became a pause, a momentary lift before gravity returned. The policies worked on paper, but not in people's lives. Hope rose, then settled back into resignation. So after decades of recovery plans, reforms, and promises, one question lingers in the silence. What if Japan's economy was never meant to recover at all?
For decades, Japan stood as an anomaly, a superpower that slowed but never fell, aging gracefully yet silently. But now, the rest of the developed world is beginning to look eerily familiar. The patterns that once defined Japan's lost decades are no longer confined to its islands. They're spreading. The OECD warns that by 2050, 1 in 4 people in advanced economies will be over 65. Fertility rates in Europe, South Korea, and even the United States are plunging below replacement levels. Public debt in many Western nations is climbing toward Japanese territory, above 120% of GDP in the US and over 140% in Italy. Productivity growth, once the engine of prosperity, has stagnated across the developed world. It's as if the future Japan once lived through has simply arrived late. For everyone else, that Japan's story isn't just about missteps, it's about inevitability. A society built on consumption can't grow when consumers disappear. An economy addicted to debt can't reform without pain. And a workforce that refuses to change its structure eventually becomes a museum of its own past. The IMF has called Japan a cautionary tale for aging societies, but quietly, the same dynamics are unfolding across the Western world. Even technology, once promised as salvation, hasn't reversed the tide. The World Bank notes that global productivity has fallen to its lowest rate in over 40 years, despite the digital revolution. Innovation is advancing, but growth isn't keeping up. Japan, once seen as a warning, is now a reflection, a mirror held up to our collective future. The question has shifted. It's no longer why Japan never recovered, but whether recovery itself still means what it once did. Because maybe Japan wasn't left behind at all. Maybe it was simply the first to arrive. For over 3 decades, Japan has lived in a kind of beautiful stillness, a nation caught between memory and momentum. Its GDP barely moved, its population shrank, and yet life continued with quiet precision. According to the IMF, Japan's real growth averaged less than 1% per year since the 1990s, a number small enough to forget, yet large enough to endure. Because even when progress stopped, the people didn't. The trains still arrive on time. The lights still burn in Tokyo's towers. Factories still hum, producing the world's most reliable machines. But beneath that perfection lies a question. What is the cost of stability when change becomes the enemy? Japan's story isn't one of failure. It's a reflection of what happens when fear of the unknown outweighs faith in the future. And as the world begins to age, to slow, to mirror Japan, perhaps the next chapter of global growth begins where Japan's story paused.